Chapter the 8th. The ugliest woman in the world. Look at his face. Did you see that funny scar? Whoa, the champion of the world himself. Whispers and pats on the back followed Harry from the instant he ventured out from his dormitory the next day. People even lined up behind a velvet rope just outside the fat bikini lady door to get a look at him, or doubled back to pass him in the corridors again, staring. Harry wished they wouldn't, because he was trying to concentrate on finding his way to classes. There were 100,000 staircases at Hogwarts, or 12 depending on which route you took, spacious ones, sweeping ones, rickety old ones, some that led somewhere different on a Friday, some that led you to a room which Harry was convinced to be the inspiration for the Addams family, some with vanishing steps halfway up that you had to avoid altogether or you'd plummet to your death, some that never ended no matter how high you climbed, only to turn around and realize you didn't go but more than a few feet up. Then there were the doors. Doors that wouldn't open unless you asked in French, or kicked them in at exactly the right place. Doors that you had to shrink yourself in order to get through. Only fifth years and up knew out to do this, and doors that looked like real doors, but if you walked through you found yourself in the middle of the lake outside the school. It was impossibly hard to remember where everything was, especially because it all seemed to move around a lot. The people in the portraits were of no help either. They constantly gave bad directions and seemed to get off on making students late to their classes, and Harry was sure the coats of armor followed him around when he wasn't looking. And if that wasn't enough, the ghosts also were of no help. It was always a nasty shock when you were on the toilet and they burst through into your stall. Practically paranoid Pete always tried to swat students' school books out of their hands because they contained evil, whatever that meant. Of course he couldn't actually do anything. His hands just went right through, but it was the annoyance of him being around and how he wouldn't leave you alone until you threw your books out the window or dropped them and ran away. But Peeves the poltergeist was worth 8 locked doors and a deadly staircase if you met him when you were tardy for class. He would hurl things at your head, belch in your ear, which also caused a rather nasty smell, or slime you so badly your skin would turn green for days and your clothes would be forever ruined. Even more dreadful than Peeves, if that was even achievable, was the caretaker, Argus Filch. He committed crimes against the students so heinous, we can't even go into them here. Filch also owned a cat called Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, hairless creature with bulging, bug-like eyes just like Filch's. She patrolled the corridors unaided. Break a rule in front of her, put just one toe in her water bowl, and she'd cry out in an ear-piercing shriek for Filch, who'd emerge from the shadows, wheezing, 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passageways of the school better than anyone, except perhaps those Weasley twins, and could appear just as suddenly as any of the ghosts. The students all hated him, and it was the fond memory of many who were able to sneak up on Mrs. Norris and give her a good kick down the hall. And then there were the bloody classes themselves. There was plenty more to this magic business, as Harry quickly found out, than waving your wand around and saying a few funny words like a lunatic. They had to study the night skies through their telescopes every Friday at midnight and learn the names of 168,000 stars. 3 times a week they had to figure their way out to the greenhouses behind the castle to study herbology, with a dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout, where they were educated in how to grow strange plants and fungi, of which they quickly discovered the hard way that most of them were poisonous. Easily the most mind-numbing class was Chronicle of Magic, which was taught by a ghost whose lectures involved him just reading from an exceptionally dry book with no pictures in a very dreary tone. Professor Binns had fallen asleep one night in a chair alongside the staff room fireplace. But a few sparks flew out during the night and ignited the all-too-shaggy rug, causing the whole room to go up in flames, taking Professor Binns to the grave, or so everyone thought. To most of the faculty's surprise, he appeared for class the next day in ghost form and has solidified that his monotonous class will be part of the school's curriculum for decades of students to come. Dumbledore likes this arrangement because Professor Binns doesn't have to be paid or fed and is secretly researching how he can bump off a few other teachers to drive further efficiency at the school. Professor Flitwick, the charms instructor, was a teeny-weeny wizard who had to stand on a mountain of books in order to see over his desk. At the start of their first class he took the roll call, and when he reached Harry's name he jumped down and ran to Harry, where he kissed and hugged his kneecaps for a good 8 awkward minutes. Professor Hardcastle McCormick was again different. Harry had been quite right to think this was a teacher who has had a hard life thanks to her unattractiveness, and she would pass that frustration on to the class as revenge. Strict and authoritarian, she gave them a good talking to the moment they sat down in her first class. There will be no rousing in this class. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone caught messing around, and you will be put in the cooler for no less than 3 days' time. This is your only warning. Harry wasn't sure what the cooler meant, but before he had time to ask Ron, Professor McCormick changed her desk into an erotic painting of herself and then quickly into one of her sitting in Dumbledore's chair at the head table when she realized her mistake. They were all very frightened and couldn't wait to get out of there, but soon were relieved to hear that they wouldn't be changing furniture into art for a long time. After taking a tremendous amount of complicated notes for the first day, they were each given a glass of water and started trying to turn it into wine. By the end of the lesson, only Hormone Granger had made any difference to her water. Professor McCormick gulped down Hormone's glass, then gave her few pats on the head in approval. All that Harry could do was turn his into a greenish bubbly liquid. The class everyone had really been looking forward to was Defense Against the Dark Side of the Force, but Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a joke. All he had them do during the first week was draw random things in the room. First they drew his bowl of fruit, then a rather odd-looking fish. Then they had to sketch Professor Quirrell duking it out with either a zombie or a troll or a dragon, student's choice. If you can draw your enemy, then you can beat your enemy, for you have the power to visualize your victory, he told the class. His classroom also smelled strongly of strange garlic, which he said was to ward off a jealous vampire he'd beaten in a card game in Romania, who had vowed to come back and get him one of these days. The funny smell hung around him, always stinking up the corridors. The Weasley twins insisted that his cowboy hat was stuffed full of garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Harry soon became very frustrated to find out that he was miles behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Mole families too, but they had all gone through a 2-week all-inclusive welcome to the magical world of magic orientation at the school a few weeks prior to the start of term. Harry clearly never even knew about this. Apparently the pig that was supposed to deliver his notification died en route to get to him. Friday was a noteworthy day for Harry and Ron. They finally managed to find their way down to the Great Hall for breakfast without something going wrong. Each day so far they had either slept in too much or got lost on the way down. The previous day, the two found themselves locked in a windowless room without a door. Seems the one they came in through was only one way. It wasn't until after lunch that a Hufflepuffer heard their screams and ran to get a teacher so they could be rescued. "What's on the schedule today?" Harry asked Ron as he engulfed his porridge in sugar. Aunt Petunia never let Harry have any more than a few pinches of sugar at home, and was determined to take advantage of his newfound situation. "Double potions with the Slytherins," said Ron. "Snape is head of Slytherin House, they say she fancies them, we'll be able to see if it's true." "Wish Hardcastle fancied us," Ron said with dreamy eyes. Harry shot Ron a confused look. Well, you know, like goes easy on us and such, since we're in her house and all." Professor Hardcastle McCormick was head of Gryffindor House, but it hadn't stopped her from giving them a colossal pile of homework on their first day. Just then, the mail arrived. Harry had gotten used to this by now, but it had given him a bit of a shock on the first morning, when about 100 pigs had suddenly stampeded into the great hall during breakfast, running around the tables until they saw their owners, and dropping letters and packages onto their laps. Pigwiggy hadn't brought Harry anything so far, which made him begin to wonder why he ever got her in the first place. She sometimes came in just to nibble on his shoes or have a bit of bacon scraps before going off to sleep in the pigery with the other school pigs. Harry was a bit concerned as to why she had such a fond taste for bacon. This morning, however, Pigwiggy jumped up into Harry's lap and dropped a note into Harry's porridge. Harry tore it open once he wiped it down with a rather loud moan. It said, in a very untidy scrawl, "Dear Scarface, I know you get Friday afternoons off, so would you like to come and have a cup o' cheddar with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send an answer back with Pigwiggy. Hagrid. P.S. Say hello to my little friend." Harry borrowed Ron's quill, scribbled "yes, please, see you later" on the back of the note, and sent Pigwiggy scampering off. It was lucky that Harry had a meeting with Hagrid to look forward to, because the potions lesson turned out to be the worst thing that had ever happened to him. At the start of term banquet, Harry had gotten the idea that Professor Snape disliked him. By the end of the first potions lesson, he knew he had been wrong. Snape didn't dislike Harry, she hated him. And for good reason. Potions lessons took place down in one of the dungeons. It was colder here than up in the mountains, and would have been quite creepy enough without the pickled animals floating in glass jars all around the walls. Snape, like Flitwick, started the class by taking the roll call, but unlike Flitwick, she was hideously ugly. She paused at Harry's name. "Ah, yes," she said softly, "Harry Potter. Our new pinball wizard." Draco Malfoy and his friends Scrabby and Goyle giggled behind their hands. Snape finished calling the names and looked up at the class. Her eyes were black like Hagrid's, but they had none of Hagrid's warmth. They were cold and empty and made you think of dark tunnels. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making," she began. She spoke in barely more than a whisper, but they caught every word. Like Professor Hardcastle McCormick, Snape had the gift of keeping a class silent without effort. As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop death, if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. More silence followed this little speech. Harry and Ron exchanged looks with raised eyebrows. Hermione Granger was on the edge of her seat and looked desperate to start proving that she wasn't a dunderhead. "Potter," said Snape suddenly. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Powdered root of what to an infusion of what?" Harry glanced at Ron, who looked as stumped as he was. Hermione's hand had shot into the air as high as she possibly could. "I don't know, ma'am," said Harry. Snape's lips curled into a sneer and eyeballs flared with rage. "You little twerp, I'm all man." He was pretty livid about that little mishap. Half the class snickered while the other just stared dumbfounded, not believing that Snape was actually a dude. "Let's try again. Potter, where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Hermione began waving her hand in every which way vigorously, but Harry didn't have the faintest idea what a bezoar was. He tried not to look at Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were still trying not to laugh from when Harry called Snape a woman. "I don't know, sir." "Thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, eh, Potter?" Harry forced himself to keep looking straight into those cold, ugly eyes. He had looked through his books at the Drubbles notes, But did Snape expect him to remember everything in 100,001 magical herbs and fungi? Snape was still ignoring Hormone's oscillating hand. "What is the difference, Potter, between Monkshood and Wolfspan?" At this, Hormone stood up on top of her seat and began jumping, her hand almost touching the dungeon ceiling. "I don't know," said Harry quietly. "I think Hormone does, though. Why don't you try her?" A few people laughed. Harry caught Seamus's eye, and Seamus winked. Snape, however, was not pleased. "Sit down," he snapped at Hormone. "For your knowledge, Potter, asphodel and wormwood make a sleeping potion so powerful it is known as the Day of Living Dead. A bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a Chinese man and it will save you from most poisons. As for Monkshood and Wolfspan, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name of aconite, tinklewipe, composer, fairy weed, gobblygonda, dewsage, bumfizzle, hickory dock, spuge, yonderware, and dazzlegan. Well? Why aren't you all taking detailed notes? Everything said in this class is examinable." There was a sudden rummaging for quills and parchment. Over the noise, someone said, "Even the part about you not being a woman?" "That's it, a point will be taken from Gryffindor House for your tongue, Potter, since you started this whole thing." It didn't improve for the Gryffindors as the potions lesson drudged on. Snape put them all into pairs and set them to mixing up a simple potion to cure cooties. He swept around in his long black cloak, watching them wade-ride, dead mosquitoes and broken hearts, disapproving of almost everyone except Malfoy, whom he seemed to be fond of. He was in the middle of telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy had stuck in his popsicle stick when there was an explosion that filled the dungeon with a deafening sound. Neville had somehow managed to blow up Seamus's cauldron, even though they were not using any explosive material. Neville, who had been drenched in the boiling potion when it discharged, moaned in pain as his skin began to melt off his face. "Idiot boy!" snarled Snape, picking up all of the skin blotches on the floor. "You had one job to do." Neville screamed as his exposed body began to bleed every which way. "Take him up to the hospital wing," Snape spat at Seamus. "And make sure you give them these." He gave Seamus a handful of Neville's skin. He then honed in on Harry and Ron, who had been working next to Neville. "You, Potter, this is all your fault. That's another point you've lost for Gryffindor." Harry assumed this must have been true. After all, weird stuff has always happened around him and he figured his mere presence must have triggered the explosion somehow. But Ron kicked him in the behind and encouraged Harry to protest. Harry opened his mouth to speak. "Don't push it," Snape muttered. "I've been told I can be very nasty." More snickering amongst the students as Harry slowly closed his mouth and continued working on the group assignment. They scaled the steps out of the dungeon an hour later, exhausted. Harry's mind was completely numb and his spirits were at a new low. Not only did he not get any of this magic stuff, he had lost 2 whole points for Gryffindor in his very first week, all because he had called Snape a woman. It wasn't long before the whole school heard what Harry had done, and this set off a great debate amongst the students of whether Snape was in fact a man or a madam. "Cheer up," said Ron, "lots of people think Snape's a lady. Even I wasn't sure until he confirmed it there. Still, you can never be sure. Not like I'm going to go peeping on him in the bathroom. Hey, speaking of weird dudes, can I come and meet Hagrid with you?" He only invited me." "Oh come on, I'll let you have some of the sweets my mum had sent if I can tag along." "Okay, sure you can impose." At 3:30 they left the castle and ran their way across the grounds after they realized what time it was. Harry had put his mind away from the Snape debacle and placed it solely on the bribe Ron had promised him. Meanwhile Ron was thinking what luck that he found a patsy to take his mum's terrible excuse for sweets off his hands. Hagrid's abode was a small wooden hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Large pairs of socks and even larger garments of underwear were strung alongside the front porch railing. As they approached the door they heard loud, booming barks. Hagrid's voice rang out, saying, "Back, Fang, back!" followed by several whipping sounds and then a faint whimper. "I heard he likes to beat dogs," said Harry to Ron. "Ah," Ron said, understanding. Harry then knocked on the door. Hagrid's big, hairy face appeared in the crack in the door that was evidently used as a peephole. "Who goes there?" he said. "That you Thodos?" "What? No, I'm Harry Potter." "Potter me lad. Well, why didn't ye say so? Come in, come in," Hagrid said as he opened the door. He let them in, but had a perplexed look when his eyes came across Ron. He bent down low and put his arm around Harry, shielding Ron with his back. Harry, who's this odder guy? Can have just any old stranger come walk in enter me residence here. These be dangerous times, ye know." "Sorry, but he promised me sweets if I'd bring him." Hagrid bent down even further and whispered in Harry's ear so only he could hear, "Okay, but ye got to give me half year take of them sweets." Harry thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "Marvellous," Hagrid bellowed as he stood up and faced Ron. "Come in both of ye, and I'll make us some capo cheddar." He winked at Harry. There was only one room inside. Dead pigs and rodents were hanging from the ceiling, in the center was an open fire, and in the corner was very big dog that was either passed out or sleeping or dead. "Hope yer like yer cheddar sharp," said Hagrid as he plopped 3 large chunks of cheese into a pot and put it over the fire. Hagrid then took a good long look at Ron. "Another Weasley, eh?" said Hagrid after a stare down. "I spent half me life chasing yer twin brothers away from me crops. And if ye got any mind at all, ye be wise to avoid their lifestyle lest ye want an arrow in your back." Hagrid wagged his finger at Ron as he said this. "No sir," Ron said in a startled reply. "Grand." At this time Hagrid picked up the pot from the fire, walked over to a table and poured the liquefied cheese into 3 separate cups and then passed them around. Harry wasn't sure what was going on, but Ron sure acted like it was perfectly normal, so Harry just followed his lead and drank it up, pretending to enjoy it. They then proceeded with telling Hagrid all about their first lessons. Harry and Ron were ever so delighted to hear Hagrid call Filch that boring old fart. "And as for that cat, Mrs. Norris, I'd like to kick her down the hall myself. D'ye know, every time I go up to the school, she tries to scratch me eyes out. Can't get rid of her, Filch puts her up to it. I just knows it, all I needs is proof." Harry told Hagrid about Snape's lesson. Hagrid, like Ron, wasn't sure either if Snape was a dude or a lady. But he claims to be a man, so. "Rubbish," said Hagrid. "I'm pretty sure Father's a woman. I mean, don't ye find her at least a little attractive?" Harry and Ron just looked at each other. "How's yer brother Charlie?" Hagrid asked Ron, quickly changing the subject. "I liked him a lot, great with his hands." Harry was quite sure that Hagrid had changed the subject on purpose. While Ron told Hagrid all about Charlie's side job at the massage parlor in Diagon Alley, Harry picked up a piece of paper that was lying on the table under the now empty cups of cheddar. It was a cutting from the Daily Heretic. Gringotts break-in happened. Inquiries continue into the incident at Gringotts on the 31st of July, widely alleged to be the work of Rouge dark wizards or witches unknown. Gringotts goblins today insisted that nothing had been taken and that we should stop calling it a break-in. The vault that was robbed had in fact been conveniently emptied the same day. But we're not telling you nothing about the baguette-shaped package that was in there, so keep your noses out if you know what's good for you, said a Gringotts spokesgoblin this afternoon. Harry recalled Ron telling him on the journey here that someone had attempted to raid Gringotts, but Ron hadn't stated the date. "Hagrid," said Harry, "that break-in happened on my birthday. It was probably happening while we were there. There was no doubt about it this time. Hagrid definitely didn't want to talk about this subject. He grunted and offered him another cup of cheddar, which Harry refused. Harry read the account again. The vault that was searched had in fact been conveniently emptied earlier that same day. Hagrid had emptied Vault 713, if you could call it emptying, taking out that strikingly similar package to the one described. Had that been what the thieves were looking for? Was Harry somehow an accomplice? As Harry walked Ron back to the castle for dinner, Harry concluded that none of the lessons he'd had so far had given him as much to think about as Capo Cheddar with Hagrid. He must now devote most of his time to solving this mystery in a world he knew zero about. Nothing was more important than this. Questions swirled in his mind. Had Hagrid collected that package just in time? Where was it now? And did Hagrid and Snape have a history he didn't want to tell Harry?